Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're finally on the road here. Welcome. Isn't it great to be out? Isn't it great to be doing a wine tasting again? God, it's been a while. Now, I'd like to introduce. I'm Hugh and Hook, by the way, in case you haven't never clapped eyes on me before. The principal reviewer for The Real Review, and on my left is Katrina Strickland, who is the editor of A Good Weekend magazine, which is the magazine that appears in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in Melbourne every weekend.
Thanks, Ewan, and welcome everybody. Yes, I've been at Good Weekend for about 4.5 years, and we brought Ewan back into the magazine to do a fortnightly column called the Full Bottle, in which he answers reader questions. And then 2 years ago we started the collaboration with The Real Review, where we would do the top 52 of their top 400 or so wineries. And it's been a great collaboration. Our readers have really loved it, and we really liked the partnership.
Let's start the tasting. And these, of course, are judiciously selected group of wines, a small group of wines, 9 wines, 3 whites, 6 reds, starting with the whites, moving through medium-bodied reds to full-bodied reds in 3 flights, with maybe a couple of curveballs thrown in. We're starting with Riesling, and then Semion, and then Chardonnay. Next flight is Pinot Noir, Sangiovese, and Grenache, or a Grenache blend. And then we'll have Cabernets and Shirazes at the end. Firstly, the first wine is Riesling Freak, number 6, aged Riesling 2015. Now this guy, John Hughes is his name, based in the Clare Valley, and he is the archetypal Riesling Freak. I think his university mates named him the Riesling Freak because he was just, when everybody else was drinking big Barossa Shiraz or big Clare Cabernet, he just wanted a Riesling. So he started his little business there in the Clare Valley. He produces about 11 wines, and they're all Riesling. So if you look at his website, there's an amazing list there. There's nothing but Riesling, and they're all great, and they're all different incarnations of Riesling. He first came to note in this part of the world probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when his Riesling won the top trophy at the Sydney Wine Show. It was a big moment for John Hughes, and he's just gone onwards and upwards since then. So this wine, I really like young Riesling, I like old Riesling, and I like it somewhere in between. It's a great variety at all stages of its life, and to me this is got those lovely, it's starting to build those lovely toasty, bready, honey characters on the nose with age. A bit of beeswax sometimes, you get that waxy character as well as the honey. And beautifully aromatic, beautifully floral. It hasn't lost its primary fruit yet, but it's starting to build the complexity of age. And it will continue doing that for quite a while. 2015 is a really good year for aging. It's a cool year. So have a taste of that. I think you'll find it's still delicate. It hasn't blown out and become broad. It's got finesse. It's nice and clean and dry on the finish. Terrific food wine. Anything fishy will go well with that. Shellfish, crustaceans, finned fish, beautiful food wine. Let's have a look at the Semion, number 2. This wine is from the Hunter Valley, and if there's one variety or one style of wine that Australia can claim is its world unique style, it's Hunter Valley Semion. I mean, yes, we've got Rutherglen Muscat, which is another one, but Hunter Valley Semion, there is Semion grown in various parts of the world, such as Bordeaux, such as South Africa, such as other parts of the world in minor amounts, but that style of wine is pretty much unique in the Hunter Valley. So you won't see grassiness in that wine. What you're starting to see is this sort of waxy character, almost a candle snuff kind of smokiness. There's an earthy character in there. The lemony character will come through more on the palate, I think. I love the delicacy of that wine. It's light-bodied. Good Hunter Semion is never heavy-bodied. It's always low in alcohol. Between 10.5% and 11.5% alcohol is the normal range for Hunter Semion. And this one, it would be about 10.5 to 11%. So that's a wine that you can drink quite a lot of without falling off your chair, which is another thing I like about it. It's really clean and dry and fresh on the finish, makes you want to have another sip. And again, a wonderful, wonderful food wine, especially with a bit of age on it like this one. 2017, it's only 4 years old, going on for 5. It's got a long life ahead of it, another 10 years, no problem. If you want a bit more weight and a bit more richness, number 3 is the wine, Chardonnay. But as Chardonnay goes, this is more at the delicate end of Chardonnay, but it's still much more fuller-bodied wine than either of the other two. First thing I noticed with that Tarrawara Chardonnay is that it comes powerfully through on the nose with this smoky, it's almost a smoked chicken kind of character. There's a chicken stock smokiness to it, which is really interesting. It's a bit of sulphide there, I think, which a lot of Chardonnays, modern Chardonnays, have a little bit of sulphide on the nose. And it's hard to tell where the oak begins and ends and where the sulphide begins and ends, but that smokiness adds an extra layer of complexity to the wine. I think when you taste it, you won't notice that so much. Still refreshing, light on the tongue. It's not heavy, it's not cloying, and it's not oaky. Beautiful finesse to it. I love that wine. It's got tightness and delicacy and length of flavour. The flavour keeps going on and on. Beautiful. Any questions, comments?
I've got a question, Hugh. When you talk about food and wine, like how do you work out what wine is good with food other than reading up about it? Can you kind of work it out yourself?
Look, I think most people work out what goes with what by trial and error, by practice. But you can read books about what goes with what. There is plenty of food and wine matching information in a lot of wine books and a lot of magazines. We write about it occasionally on The Real Review, especially if we come across something that's really interesting. But I think that there are certain basic rules. Light goes with light, so light-bodied wines go with delicate foods, and heavy wines go with richer foods. I guess that's why most people would serve white wine at the beginning of the meal, because you have lighter foods then, and red wines later in the meal. Red wine, of course, has tannin, which goes with things that have protein in them, such as cheeses and meats and even fish. By the way, when something I needed to mention is that these glasses are the Plum 3 glasses. We use those in all of our events.
Question, Huon.
Yes.
Probably more one of stylistic preference, but you mentioned, Chardonnay shifting to less oaky potentially. You mentioned, the smoked chicken on the nose. I really love the Tarrawara, and I know, for example, raw review reader, you don't necessarily like stems. What do you think of, or green, what do you think of reduction and I guess, struck match? Because how does that tie into Chardonnays at the moment?
I think the main part of the question was, do I like the struck match character? Do I think it's good in wines like the Tarrawara Chardonnay? It's a bit of a fashion thing, I have to say. A few years ago that we weren't doing it as much as we are now. I think a little bit of that is really nice. Too much of it is overpowering, and a lot of New Zealand wines that I'm tasting at the moment have far too much of it. New Zealand winemakers seem to have embraced this character with a little excessive zeal in some places. What we're trying to do, I think, is always add more complexity to wine. And if you've tasted an unwooded Chardonnay that's very basic and very simple and often very cheap, they're a little bit boring. They need to have extra layers added to them by the way that the winemaker has made them.
Can you discuss the scoring? Because it seems everyone's getting between 95 and 99 these days, so you look at buying some wine, I really don't take into account the score.
A lot of people are making this observation now, but I think if you look at our website and you look at most of our competitors' websites, if you look deeply at what they're doing, there's a lot of wines that score quite low. But there are more and more wines that score high, and I think that's because wine is getting better and better. And you have to say, well, what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time if they continue making better wine? Are we going to go over 100? I don't think so. I think things will just get, we'll just get tougher at marking if we have to. But, and it's the age-old question, can you continue to improve something indefinitely? Well, theoretically, yes, you can.
So is it economically better for a winery to pitch higher? Like, is that part of why wines have become more expensive and better? Because if you're running a winery, you know, economically you're better at the top end than at the entry level?
Well, I think that everybody now wants to have what they can call an icon wine. So if you go to the Barossa now, every winery has at least one wine that's over $100. And some of them are just sitting there. They're not really selling much, but they like to have it sitting there just to show people that they can produce an icon wine that's $200 a bottle or whatever. So there's a lot of image involved in that, but there is now a market for these wines. That's the critical thing. There are people out there who want these wines, who are prepared to pay for them, and who put them in their cellar or show them off to their friends as a way of, you know, saying, you know, I value you as a friend, so I'm going to open a really expensive bottle for you tonight. There is a market for great wine now that didn't exist before, and it's been growing steadily pretty much all the time I've been involved in the wine business.
I noticed that here in Australia it's like easier when you go to a vineyard. Like if you have money, you can buy all of the wine they produce. But like in Europe, it's much different because some vineyards, as you said, like they are very small. So even in Italy, in some area, you go there, they show you like the cellar, but you cannot buy the wine. It's been maybe ordered for 15 years by other people. So it's a completely different market. And I think it's really also good that the fact that you, at the moment, everyone try to be at the top because it's more like in terms of quality. So it's a bit too pricey here in Australia, I think. But some vineyards can have a very good wine.
I think the market will sort it out. If we've got wines that are overpriced, they'll come down, or they will stay the same until inflation catches up with them and they'll start to look less expensive. This is what happens. But yes, you're right. In Europe, you can't just walk into wineries, and even in California, you can't just walk into wineries and expect to taste their best wines. More and more wineries in Australia and in California, to use two examples, are charging now for tasting, and that's fair enough. If you pay a fee, you can taste their best wines. Quite a lot of Australian wineries now are very limited in what they'll sell you. For example, Rockford's famous basket press, Shiraz. The limit per customer is 6 bottles. And this is becoming a thing in lots of places around the world. The demand for great wines and collectible wines, wines which have the kind of iconic status, is just getting out of control. Okay, reds, go. Here we go. Talking about Max Schubert. Max Schubert, the great creator of Grenache, used to say every white wine would be a red wine if it could. So I don't subscribe to that, but he was definitely a red wine man. The first one's Pinot, which Macedon ranges, Bindi. Talking about rarity and great wines that are becoming difficult to get, Bindi is becoming a little in that category. So we're thrilled to have them here because this wine is, I guess, one of the iconic Pinots of Australia. It's not easy to get, and I think the quality is getting better and better. This is a wine, this 19 vintage we've got here, I think it is the Block 5, and I think it's one of the deepest flavoured, most intense wines that they've made. 2019 is a great vintage for them, partly because of the year, but partly because their vines are getting older and older. Particularly with Pinot Noir, vine age is a very important thing. A lot of Australian Pinots are light-coloured, light-bodied, ethereal, pretty wines, but not really great wines for keeping long-term, like a great Burgundy is. This is starting to get more into the serious Pinot spectrum. Seriously good wine. I love this wine. Have you tried it, yeah. Katrina? That's a serious colour. Most Aussie Pinots aren't as dark coloured as that. And colour, of course, is not everything with Pinot. You can have intensity of flavour without a deep colour with Pinot. That's the way it is, the nature of the beast.
Can I ask you? No, with Pinot, people often say it's the most difficult, don't they? The most tricky. Why is that?
Pinot Noir, the yields have to be low. In other words, the production of grapes per vine has to be quite low. Otherwise, you get more rosé, depending on where it's grown. If you're growing it in the perfect site, where the vine is in natural balance, you wouldn't have to take bunches off and reduce the crop load. So at Bindi, I don't think they do much crop thinning at all. Most years, probably none. In a lot of Pinot Noir vineyards, they thin the crop. They go around and snip bunches off because otherwise the bunches that are remaining won't have enough intensity of flavour or colour or anything, depending on the year. If you have a lot of rain, you have bigger crops and you have more dilute wine. If you have a drought, you tend to have smaller crops, smaller berries and a more concentrated wine. So in a sense, they're trying to replicate a naturally low-yielding vine in a naturally low-yielding vineyard. That's when you get your great intensity of flavour. Great Pinot is only produced in cool vineyards, and cool vineyards normally have a higher cost of production. The reason is that their fruitfulness is less because of the less sunlight, and we don't want to go into the physiology of grapevines here, but they naturally produce lower yields. Lower yields will cost you more per acre to produce the wine. And secondly, when you have a cooler, wetter climate, cooler climates are normally wetter, you have more disease pressure, therefore you've got to put more effort into the vine and keeping the bugs away and the pests away than you would in a warm climate like the Barossa or Clare. Next wine is Sangiovese, and this is from Beechworth. So Sangiovese is a relatively new variety. It doesn't have the great history as in Australia as Cabernet Shiraz and Grenache have, but Sangiovese is coming up fast on the inside rail, and people like this guy at Fighting Gully Road, Mark Walpole is his name, he used to be the chief vineyard manager at Brown Brothers, a man with enormous experience in vineyards. He's more of a vineyard guy than a winemaker, but he produces Fighting Gully Road, and this is from his own vineyard at Beechworth. It's called La Longa because it's been given extra time in the barrel and extra time in the bottle before it's released. So long aging, 2 years in barrel, 1 year in bottle, and then on the market. Most people would be releasing their Sangiovese after 1.5 or 2 years. Anyway, the great thing about Sangiovese is if you think that most Australian red wines would be fruity and emphasising the berry characters of the fruit, Sangiovese is normally more savoury. So fruity at one end of the spectrum, savoury at the other. It's dry, very dry on the finish. A lot of tannin, leaves you with this lovely cleansing, drying tannin aftertaste, which just happens to go beautifully with food. So protein, anything with protein you need with this. The last wine in the lineup is Grenache. So it's not entirely Grenache, it's a blend, but it's about 75% Grenache. And you know that in the Barossa they produce a lot of GSMs, Grenache Shiraz Mourvedre blends, which are loosely modelled on Côte de Rhône, Châteauneuf de Pape, those sorts of wines from the southern Rhône. And usually in Australia there's a lot of Shiraz in these blends, and the Shiraz tends to dominate the blend. What I love about this wine is the Shiraz doesn't dominate, the Shiraz is less than 20%, 75% or something like that of Grenache. The Grenache is the variety that does the talking. So when you smell it, you can smell that lovely raspberry character of the Grenache. Very fresh, very fruity. I was talking about fruity versus savoury before. This is definitely a fruity accented wine. Beautiful nose, very perfumed, lovely, but not especially complex. But if you want to age it for a few years, it'll become more complex. In the Barossa, they talk about Grenache being the Pinot Noir of the Barossa. Can you see a kinship there? Soft tannins, lovely sweet fruit, rounded palate shape and structure, not much tannin, or not too much tannin. This one's got a bit, but generally the tannins are quite light in Grenache. And of course they can't produce decent Pinot in the Barossa, so Grenache is their fallback variety, if you like. I think it does a very good job, especially in the hands of great winemakers like the Henschkes, who are now in their 6th generation, 7th generation coming up. So 3 very different wines, I think 3 very smart wines, but I'm going to have another sip of that Pinot before I chuck it. The great thing about the great vineyards, the great producers are people who control their own vines. The great wines are always made from a patch of vines that people either own or control. Any more questions while we're in this little transitional phase?
Do you think more winemakers will give Grenache a little bit of time in the sun? Because a lot of them are very Shiraz heavy.
Yeah, the question is, will more winemakers give Grenache its place in the sun in these GSM blends? Well, I don't know, that's up to them. I think that that the pendulum is swinging that way. I hope that this will happen, but I think that we are seeing now a lot of straight Grenache wines around the industry, which are beautiful wines, light to medium-bodied wines. McLaren Vale is doing really, really well with that style of wine. So if you love Grenache, then seek out the ones that are just called Grenache. Serious producers are getting serious about Grenache. Only a few years ago, you could buy Grenache in McLaren Vale whenever you wanted it for the cheapest price from the growers. Now, you pay more than you pay for Shiraz, and you can't get it because everybody wants it. So there's a big Grenache revolution happening at the moment. A lot of those fruit, the grapes used to go into rosé as well, and now they're being put into red wine instead. I'll start talking about these next three reds because the first 1 and 2 are both Cabernet blends. Number 1 is coming out, which is the Cullen Diana Madeline, one of the great wines of Australia these days. Diana Madeline was the name of the mother of the current winemaker, Vanya Cullen. It's very much a female outfit, Cullens. Yes, Kevin Cullen and his wife Diana established it back in the 1960s, 1971. They've had their 50th anniversary this year. Kevin, of course, was a GP, worked in Bustleton. His wife brought up 6 children and managed to run the farm and the vineyard and make the wine. Extraordinary woman, Diana Madeline. And her daughter Vanya is an extraordinary woman as well. Diana's she's gone now, but Vanya has taken it to another level. She's gone crazy about biodynamics, and everything she does is environmentally sensitive. So the winery and the vineyard are carbon positive. In other words, they take more carbon out of the environment than they put into it. And they do it by proper means. They don't buy carbon credits. They are absolutely deadly serious about the quality of the wine, but at the same time doing the right thing by the land and the environment. The wines have never been better. So how does she manage to do that? I don't know. She's very clever. This wine is always a blend of Cabernet with the other Bordeaux varieties, but Cabernet Sauvignon is always really the dominant variety. So there's Cabernet Franc, there's Merlot, there's Petit Verdot, and a bit of Malbec in there as well. But the dominant variety is Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's how the wine tastes. It tastes more like Cabernet Sauvignon than anything. Have a quick look at that. So that to me shouts Margaret River immediately. It's got cassis on the nose, black currants, blackberries, violets, blueberries, that sort of spectrum of aromas. It's more the blue fruits than the black fruits in a sense. Beautiful nose. Very young, of course, this wine. It's going to be a 20, 25, 30 year wine. We're seeing it as a baby at the moment. The intensity of flavour in that is really something special, and they do it without much tannin. I mean, there's a lot of tannin there, but the tannin is not puckering your mouth and gluing your lips together. It's subtle, it's beautiful tannin. And the length of flavour, it's an effortless wine. It's not a heavy wine, it's not a clumsy wine, it's not a tannic or blocky wine. And the last thing it would be is an oaky wine, because they're very careful about the amount of oak the amount of new oak that they use at Cullen. So a beautifully, beautifully balanced wine. I think that's a smashing wine and one of the best that they've made. Moving on to the next wine, which is sort of an alter ego, really. If you wanted the modern, that's the Cullen. If you wanted the traditional, that's the Penfolds. And it's great to have Penfolds here because Max Schubert, of course, back in 1960, he created this wine, Bin 389. And the famous 1962 Bin 60A. Has anybody here tasted that wine? It is probably the greatest wine ever made in Australia, I think. And that's a Cabernet Shiraz blend. It's a Coonawarra Cabernet Barossa Shiraz. And quite a few people are now rediscovering this classic Australian blend. But let's have a look at this wine. The colour is almost black in its amazing colour, but that's typical Penfolds as well. And when you smell it, the oak really jumps out of that glass, but it's not as oaky as they used to be in the past. I think they've toned back the oak a little bit. But it is still very much a Penfolds wine. If you gave me that wine blind, my first guess would be Penfolds. They're not the only people that make a style like that, but it is very typical wine. So it's a blend of many vineyards and many regions, and that again is the Penfolds way. They're not into single vineyard, single region wines. They do one or two single vineyard wines. The McGill Estate is obviously one, but most of their wines are blends. But terrific wine, and people try and say that the best wines are single vineyard wines. I don't agree with that at all. I think some of them are, but it doesn't have to be a single vineyard wine to be a great wine.
What's the reason the old world doesn't like Cabernet Shiraz blend?
What's the reason the old world doesn't like Cabernet Shiraz blend? Sorry, I've got a mouthful of tannin after that. I can barely speak, because that is a wine that makes you sit down and pay attention. It really is. It's wow, that is a mouthful of wine. You know you've drunk that, don't you? That wine is the foundation of a lot of people's cellars, including when I was a bit younger. I used to buy a lot of that wine, and it's a great cellaring wine. These days it's $100 a bottle, but when I was a bit younger, I could actually afford that wine, and I used to buy a few bottles of it. It is one of the great wines that should be a foundation of people's cellars, probably still is for those who can afford it. Why doesn't the rest of the world embrace the Cabernet Shiraz blend? And I think it's simply that it hasn't really occurred to them. If you look at France, which is the home of both of those grape varieties, Cabernet was always down the southwest, Bordeaux area. Shiraz was always in the Rhone Valley, which is the other side of the country. The Rhone Valley, Hermitage, Côte-Rôtie, Saint-Joseph, and all of those wonderful wines. So the twain never really met. Anyway, that is a stunning wine. It's a big wine. It's a powerful wine. It's a hairy-chested bloke's wine, and there's a place for that. Why not? I think it's great that Penfolds continue making that style of wine. Finally, our winery of the year is Yarra Yering, and so that's why we've left this wine till last. It's not last because it's the biggest. I think it's probably going to be outgunned by the Penfolds. But we just left it till last because they're our #1 winery this year. In Melbourne, we had Sarah Crowe, the winemaker, there. She's not here today, as far as I know. But this wine is an exceptional wine because they've only been producing the black label Carrodus wines for the last few years. And they are made from the oldest vines on the property, planted by the founder, Dr. Bailey Carrodus, back in 1969. So there you go. Is it because the vines are that old that they produce the best wine, or is it because they happen to produce the best wine that they put it in a label that costs $250? I think it's partly a bit of each. Bailey Carrodus was a botanist. He was a plant pathologist, I think. He was not a winemaker, but he taught winemaking. He taught viticulture at Roseworthy College for a while. But he knew about vines, he knew about plants, and he knew where to plant his vines when he planted Yarra Yering. So I suspect that the vines that he planted in the beginning were on the best bits of land, and that's why they're producing the best wine today. Second factor would be that they're nice and old now. They're, more than 40 years old. So this wine, I think, is an exceptional wine because of all those reasons, but also because that vintage was a great year for Shiraz in the Yarra Valley. Let's have a taste. So what you should be getting out of this wine is, it should be spicy. Cool climate Shiraz is normally spicy. Hot climate Shiraz is blackberries and chocolate and stuff like that, but less spicy. Cool climate Shiraz is more elegant, not as full-bodied, not as tannic. The tannins are finer, and you get the spice and the red fruit characters. There's a bit of smokiness on the nose there, which comes from the barrels. Pretty complex nose, really like that. And the palate is just so gorgeous. I mean, for a wine that's only 3 years old, that just slips down like a little, what do they say in Burgundy? Like a little Jesus in velvet pants. One of those silly Burgundy, traditional Burgundy statements. There is something very, very slurpable about that wine. But apart from the fact that it's beautiful now, that will be beautiful for the next 25 years, no problem. because the track record is there. We know that Yarra Yering wines age beautifully for a long time, especially from the great vintages. So, interesting comparison between those three wines. You can go back and forth between the wines and just compare them, and it's a really fascinating little lineup, I think. A little snapshot of what Australia does really, really well. But are there any questions before we close up? And did you have a favourite wine? Yell it out. Sangiovese, great, okay. Any others? Diana Madeline?
It's just so unapproachable at the moment, isn't it? Like drinking wine, like you could sniff it all day, but you're missing out on what you can get
by keeping it for a while. No, the comment here is that the Diana Madeline he thinks is his favourite, but he thinks it's just too young to drink. I think I could happily drink a bit of that now, but at the back of my mind would be the thought that if I could keep this for a while, it would be so much better. And if you're paying $120 or whatever it costs, you really want to get the full payoff, don't you? You want to get your investment realised. So the best way to do that is to keep it for a while. Infanticide if you drink it too young. Dear editor?
I have one last question. I noticed you spit a lot, Hugh, and how do you not become an alcoholic as a wine expert?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, how long have you got? But no, though I've known quite a few people in the industry who've suffered and succumbed to the terrors of alcohol, and I think it's just luck. I think you're either born, there's something that some people are born with which predisposes them to not being able to handle their drink. Spitting is a very, very important thing, and I hope most of you or all of you have been spitting most of the wine today because that's the way you keep your senses, apart from staying on your feet and keeping your brain in shape and not slurring your words or whatever. If you want to think properly, you've got to have a clear head, and tasting wine properly is about thinking as well as what goes into your mouth. If your head is not working properly, you're wasting the opportunity. That's why all wine professionals spit. And we can taste, 100 wines a day, more than 100 wines a day, without getting under the weather. Anyway, I think we should close off there because it's over time. But great to have you all here. I hope you've enjoyed those top wines from the top wineries of Australia 2021. And very much thank you to my editor, Katrina, for coming along and giving me a job as well occasionally. Thanks, Katrina.
And thank you, Ewan, from all of us, for your font of information.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed this, follow us and subscribe to The Real Review.